All right, let's dive right into this explainer and uncover the absolutely fascinating, totally hidden history of why drinking plain water used to be a terrifying gamble. It's something we completely take for granted today, right? But for the vast majority of human history, a simple glass of water was literally a life or death decision. Picture this for a second. You're standing next to a beautiful, crystal clear river, say 4,000 years ago. The water looks absolutely perfect. It's cold, it's clean, and it's practically begging to be scooped up and gulped down after a long day of hauling stone or herding animals. But believe it or not, scooping up that water could actually be the absolute worst, deadliest decision of your entire life. Look, what's really wild here is the stark contrast between that inviting, clean appearance of the water and the lethal reality of waste and pathogens just lurking beneath the surface. Take ancient Mesopotamia, for example. Right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they essentially used those massive waterways as giant, completely unregulated utility systems. We're talking about dumping waste, washing animals, burying the dead near the banks, the whole shebang. There were zero regulations and absolutely no concept of bacteria. If the water looked clear, people just assumed it was fine. And that one single assumption, it killed a staggering number of people through dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and unseen parasites. Okay, let's move on to Section 1, Fueled by Fermentation, Empire's Survival Secret. So, when the water is deadly, what do you drink? Well, the Mesopotamians, they adapted by basically obsessing over brewing. In fact, beer was so central to their daily life that they dedicated an entire goddess to it, Ninkasi, and even wrote out these beautiful hymn-like recipes on clay tablets thousands of years before the printing press was even a thought. The magic here lies in two absolutely crucial steps: boiling the water and the fermentation process. Those two actions practically wiped out the deadly organisms in the water. They had zero knowledge of microbiology. Actually, scratch that, they didn't even know what a microbe was. But through brutal trial and error, they figured out that people who drank fermented beverages just lived longer and got sick way less often. And this brilliantly illustrates the Egyptian approach too. Over in ancient Egypt, the Nile River was their lifeblood, sure. But drinking from it meant risking schistosomiasis. That's a really nasty parasite that would literally burrow into the skin and wreck a person's health for decades. We've actually found it preserved inside mummies. So to survive, the Egyptians relied on this thick, almost soupy beer. Now, this wasn't some fun happy hour treat. This was a daily ration given to pyramid builders just to protect them from the river. I mean, imagine explaining to a modern construction crew that their beer ration is technically workplace safety equipment, right up there with hard hats and steel-toed boots. No way, right? Section 2. Global Brewing, Worldwide Solutions. Take the Romans, for instance. We all know they're famous for their aqueducts, an absolute engineering marvel that kept water moving. But there's a fascinating catch here. The water going directly into the homes of the elite traveled through toxic lead pipes. Get this, the word plumbing literally comes from plumbum, which is the Latin word for lead. So while the incredibly wealthy were slowly poisoning themselves with heavy metals without even realizing it, regular citizens were relying on public fountains, which, were better, but still incredibly vulnerable to contamination during wars, sieges, or droughts. Now, if we zoom out and take a global tour, we notice how totally different cultures solved the exact same invisible threat. The ancient Greeks, they didn't drink plain water, but they also thought drinking straight wine was barbaric, so they diluted their wine with water. The alcohol acted as this sort of antimicrobial safety net. Over in ancient China, the culture built rich traditions around boiling water for tea, brilliantly killing pathogens in the process. Down in Mesoamerica, they fermented agave sap to make a culturally massive drink called pulque. And if you look at the Norse or really sailors around the world, they relied heavily on ale, simply because fresh water stored in wooden barrels at sea quickly turned foul, slimy, and deadly on those long voyages. So, bringing it back to the Romans, specifically the military, which had to march thousands of miles away from safe infrastructure, they had a drink called pasca. This was a cheap, super portable, sour wine vinegar mixture. It definitely wasn't a luxury item, but the acidic properties of the vinegar actively neutralized biological threats in untreated water. Think about that for a second. An entire empire's military logistics were essentially built on the assumption that this acidic drink would keep the army alive when marching through hostile, disease-ridden territories where the local water was a guaranteed gamble. Section 3. The drunk myth. Were they always drunk? All right, we've got to address the elephant in the room here. When we talk about all of this daily alcohol consumption, even for children in some medieval regions, It is super easy to ask. Were our ancestors just stumbling around in a perpetual drunken haze from sunrise to sunset? I mean, how did they accomplish anything? Well, the answer is a massive, resounding no. As you can see, there is a huge difference in estimated alcohol by volume, or ABV, between ancient and modern drinks. Ancient beverages like that Greek diluted wine and the thick Egyptian ration beer had a significantly lower alcohol content compared to, say, your modern pint to a local bar. These beverages were specifically designed to prioritize calories, nutrition, and hydration over intoxication. They were functioning as a critical survival technology, just hiding in plain sight as your everyday meal accompaniment. It is incredibly important to remember, these ancient societies maintained absolute clarity. You don't build sprawling, mathematically perfect pyramids, invent complex writing systems, or run trade networks spanning thousands of miles if your entire workforce is in a permanent stupor. And for the record, they absolutely did still drink plain water, but only when it came from deeply trusted, community-maintained springs or deep wells that generations of careful observation had proven safe.
Section 4. Germ Theory, Changing Everything.
Before the 1800s, people were completely in the dark. And there's this really fascinating quirk of human history here. Ancient civilizations had the exact right survival behavior, avoiding untreated water, but entirely the wrong reasoning. If someone got sick from river water, they blamed it on bad air, curses, angered gods, or imbalanced bodily fluids. They were treating the right problem with a completely imaginary medical framework. Then, everything finally clicks into place scientifically in the mid-1800s. That's when a scientist named John Snow traced a devastating cholera outbreak in London directly back to a single contaminated water pump. This mapped evidence was a huge breakthrough. Soon after, Louis Pasteur and others developed germ theory. Finally, humanity had the actual scientific vocabulary to explain the invisible microbes that countless generations had only fought off instinctively through brewing and boiling. And that brings us up to today. Honestly, modern water treatment, filtration, chlorination, strict public health regulations is frankly one of the most underrated achievements in all of human history. The simple ability to just walk into your kitchen, safely turn on a faucet, and drink without a second thought, that convenience rests on the foundation of centuries of tragic, brutal trial and error. So the very next time you take a sip of water, crack open a cold beer, or brew a simple cup of tea, I want you to remember that strange historical thread connecting you straight back to Mesopotamian brewers and Roman soldiers. And it leaves us with this final provocative thought. What other historical survival tactics do you think are hiding in plain sight in your everyday habits right now? Thank you so much for checking out this explainer, and keep questioning the history of everything around you.